So this is just the cover of the most recent report we issued from February of 2015, and there will be another one now that we have a new data set that will look at the progress since then. And according to the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, they just released a brief summary that saying that suspension rates across the nation are down by about 20%. So in just a 2-year period, that's a tremendous decline. This next graph shows how, for a long period, suspension rates were increasing, but as you can see, this graph shows you that this is based on K through 12 numbers of students suspended at least once. So we're not counting suspensions here, we're counting actual unduplicated numbers of students. And it really demonstrates the racial impact that as school districts have adopted zero tolerance or no excuses kinds of policies, we see a dramatic increase, but especially for black students. So the racial gap grew tremendously, and I suspect, and based on our analysis in California and elsewhere, that the gap is now narrowing as suspension rates are starting to come back down. It's really important to look at the data disaggregated not only by the major and racial ethnic groups, but also breaking it down by looking at what's going on in elementary schools versus secondary schools, looking at disability, the confluence of race and disability, looking at the school level so that you're looking at within your district, looking at your elementary schools, but also K through 8. You may have some charter schools, and really looking at the school level differences. And if you have the data, and many districts do, looking at the disability type. So we know that, for example, students with emotional disturbance are suspended at nationally about 33% K through 12. That's just incredibly high percentage of students with emotional disturbance suspended at least once out of school. So here's the breakdown very briefly. You can see how in elementary schools versus secondary schools, for all these groups, the suspension rates, double or triple, and you can see that the differences, the racial disparities, also expand as suspensions are used more often. So there's a tremendous disconnect. There's a lot to maybe be learned from what's going on in elementary schools in terms of approach to behavior. Of course, kids are more likely to challenge authority, but there are some developmental aspects of what goes on in a secondary school, but in terms of what goes on in the brains of children that maybe isn't being adjusted to in ways that would help keep more kids in school. So, but it's also just goes to the point that if you're looking at K through 12 data, you might be missing some really large disparities, and the most frequent use of suspensions tends to be in the middle schools and the high schools. So here is a breakdown, just as an example, when you look at race with disability status with gender. So this is now looking at and this is at the secondary level. So we find, if you see the largest bar across there, tells you that black male students at the secondary level, that 34%, this is across all their disabilities, not emotional disturbance, so 34%. So more than 1 in 3 black male students with a disability at the secondary level were suspended out of school at least one time. If we were counting suspensions, these numbers would look even higher, and we'll talk about the importance of looking at both the unduplicated counts as well as the counts of suspensions. But we're still looking at only unduplicated counts. One of the things that's very encouraging is oftentimes the schools and districts that are suspending students at very high numbers, they may be doing things that in terms of changing their codes of conduct, or they may be pursuing policies that they can have, by changing those policies, they can have a dramatic impact in a short period of time. In Baltimore, for example, now they dramatically reduced suspensions by eliminating suspensions for truancy. So this graph shows you of the 20 large districts that had very high rates, that had the really large declines. Across those 20, the black suspension rates went from 52%. So that's just an average. That's over half the black students enrolled. This is at the secondary level, but it's down to 21%. So in a very short period of time, that's a huge decline. And you see there was declines as well for Latinos and for white students. So whatever was going on in these districts, and we didn't do that piece of the analysis, but it did have a tremendous impact when changes were pursued. So the other thing to keep in mind is that within your districts, within your state, there are very likely schools or districts with similar demographics that have lower suspension rates. There's a lot to be learned from principals, superintendents, in the neighboring district or the neighboring school. And what we found is that, and these are somewhat, the cut points were based on looking at national averages, and we designated that if a school, or this is a school analysis, so if a school suspended 25% or more of any of these subgroups, kids with disabilities or major racial ethnic groups, that school is labeled high suspending. And if every one of those groups was 10% or lower, it was designated lower suspending. And at the secondary level, we found that there were 8,000 in the high suspending category, but more, 13,000 in the lower suspending category. And we performed a similar analysis at the elementary level, just changed the rubric. So the high was 10% or more, any group over that, and every group at 2% or below. And again, you see tremendous numbers of schools across the country with very low suspension rates. So this idea that, maybe they found something that worked, in academic research, this is just showing that answers are right there around the corner, that there are schools and districts that may never have even increased suspension rates. And so there are a lot of educators to learn from in terms of what works.